welcome to the Wine Access Unfiltered podcast. It's January. Vanessa, Happy New Year. We're in it. We're doing it. 2023 is upon us. How you feeling?
I'm feeling great. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I imagine that January is not dry for you like some others.
I have never done dry January. No, I have not done dry January, nor do I plan on
it. What about Veganuary? Veganuary. I've been struggling with how to actually say this. January in which we go vegan.
Yeah, I know. I'm not quite sure where to put the stress on the word. Anyway, no, I eat a lot of plant-based food just in general. I'm not vegan or vegetarian, but I like it. But I haven't actually ever committed to a whole month. Have you?
No, I've committed to 2 weeks in my life, and it was very expensive. And and truthfully, I mean, that's actually a serious thing. Like when I was in New York and I was very poor, I was like, I'm going to eat like plant-based for a while. And one, it was very challenging. And two, it was very expensive. So that's the longest I've ever gone. But I think both of us living in California, that lifestyle is a lot more achievable and attainable because of where we live. But also, it's January. I think it's a time where everybody reflects on this past year, where they want to be in the future. And so as a result, everyone likes to hit the reset, or some people like to hit the reset button and move towards a healthier lifestyle. And so for some people, that involves bringing more vegetables into their lives. And so, I don't think that either of us are moving towards vegan anytime soon, but I do always love to incorporate more vegetables in my life. And since it's very clear that we're not getting rid of the wine anytime soon, I figured it was the perfect opportunity to talk about how we can marry those two ideas together by still drinking wine and bringing more plants into the fold. And who better to assist with that than the wine director for the restaurant that has gone full plant-based. So please welcome to the show the wine director at 11 Madison Park, 3 Michelin-starred restaurant, Gabrielle DeBella. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Happy New Year to the two of you also. And yeah, very, very thrilled to be here with you.
We're really excited. I never thought that we would do a podcast on vegan wine pairings, and not that we're gonna I think for anyone listening is like, I'm not a vegan, I'm turning this off. It's not what this show is going to be. Calm down. Yeah. We're going to talk about plant-based and how to, really how to marry something that has traditionally been, I think, a little bit scary for some people. How does what wines do vegetables actually work with? I think we think of steak and we think of cab and we think of cheese and we think of Sauvignon Blanc, but vegetables have traditionally been a little bit of a pain point when it comes to traditional wine pairing. So that's really where we're going to focus on today. And I also want to dive into this transition that 11 Madison Park had because wild, amazing, but wild. And I'm so curious about how it all went down for you. So before we get into that, it's going to be a juicy episode, beet juice, mostly carrot juice. We're going to jump into some cultural events that are happening around the wine world. Vanessa, you and I kind of touched on something that's been happening in Bordeaux in a previous episode, but there has actually been sort of an update on this, and I think it's worth mentioning because there's a bit more that we didn't get into, and since Gabrielle's here with us, I want to talk about this article titled "The Existential Crisis of Bordeaux's Small Grape Growers." And so, we had talked about the fact that because of the, who would have thought that Europe isn't drinking as much wine and there's an overproduction of Bordeaux happening. But that is the case. And there's a surplus of Bordeaux wine at an entry level. We're not talking about premium. Chateau Margaux is not going on sale anytime soon. So you can all just calm down. But we're talking about
sadly.
Sadly, no, it is still the same price and probably going to get more expensive. But what we're talking about is the more entry level Bordeaux production. And so people are very upset, so much so that there were 1,000 angry vignerons and their allies marching through the streets of Bordeaux and right up to the doors of the Bordeaux Wine Council, the CIVB, really upset that Europe was not going to subsidize the grubbing or the yanking out of those vineyards, which is essentially what needs to happen. Because in Bordeaux, with the surplus being down and people having vineyards and nowhere for these grapes and these wines to go, there really aren't a lot of options. You have to cultivate your vines in Bordeaux, or you have to yank them out. Those are your two options. And so what they're asking for is €10,000 per hectare, and that is clearly not going to happen. So a very complicated issue. I'm curious on both of your thoughts. Gabrielle, I know you've got some long history in Europe. You're born to both a French and Italian family. What are you seeing? What do you think about all this?
It is a complicated issue, and I think Bordeaux is definitely one of those first region that really highlight the issue. Being that, like you mentioned, like the big shadow, the big names, they're always gonna do good, because they have such an outreach worldwide that collectioners gonna keep buying those wine, like regardless. And we've seen it in the past 10 years, like regardless of like the price increase, the wine still sells out without any issue. When it comes to a smaller grower, I mean, as I want to say, as a generation, and like right now worldwide, we are all drinking less, and that's a fact. And when all those smaller grower, more entry-level style of wine will be available in small wine shop or small supermarket in France, in the Bordeaux region, would have been like drunk throughout the week by locals. That is less and less the case. And I think Bordeaux has especially this issue because the region is so big and so complex compared to other. Like we can't compare Bordeaux to Burgundy. Burgundy, like the diversity of appellation, the small size of the plot and crop, Burgundy will never have an issue in a way, because when Meursault is sold out, well, we move to Saint-Aubin, and when Saint-Aubin will be sold out, we'll move to Rully, and like, et cetera, we will move to other smaller appellations that will also sold out.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, Vanessa, what are you seeing in terms of like people importing and exporting out of Bordeaux? Are you seeing people really trying to move these more entry-level wines?
I haven't really seen it in the United States shifting that yet. I don't see people aren't like knocking at my door every day like, please buy all this Bordeaux, but it's always, but I will say about Bordeaux is it's always available.
Yes.
So different where like Napa, it's like, there's a prestige in saying like, oh, I only, harvested, fill in the blank per acre. And it sounds better the smaller the number that you say, but Bordeaux has never been afraid of quantity, which has made them great and really important in the global marketplace. But then when something like this happens, and also I think something important to remember is there's a huge outlay of cash. If they can't grub up the vineyards and they're forced to harvest, I mean, there's the viticulture, there's the labor that takes, during the whole year, plus harvest, and labor is hard to find now globally, as we know. So you have all of that. You have, barrels, packaging, you have bottles and corks, and it's a never sort of ending bill that's arriving on your door as a vintner. So it's I'm sure really stressful, and for a lot of these people, I'm sure this is like a multi-generational family business.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the points made in the article, right? Generational issues are happening. People are trying to retire and they can't because there's nowhere there's no one to take over at this point.
Mm-hmm.
How much of this do you think is a marketing issue? Is Bordeaux affected by the fact that I think our generation and potentially younger generations see Bordeaux as our parents and our grandparents' wine? And so we're just, not only are we not drinking as much, we're also not interested in Bordeaux. And do you think that if it is a marketing issue, could it potentially be rectified in that way?
I think there is definitely a bit of that. And I have definitely experienced it in the past, and especially in London, in my previous positions, where you can see the new generation not wanting to drink what their parents and grandparents used to drink. But also, like, a significant part of the Bordeaux production will be sweet wine. And we drink less and less and less sweet wine. And I think, like, it is definitely one appellation, or like a few appellations, especially Barsac and Sauternes, that have like tackled the issue for the past 10 years, trying to like reverse this trend of like, a Sauternes has to be drunk with 15 years of age. Well, actually, they are shifting and adapting their winemaking technique to make sure that those bottles are actually approachable a little younger. And there's been like some chateaux that have been like also advertising and communicating on like adding soda water to it, etc.
And Yquem spritz is what we're doing.
I think Yquem is probably the one that's a little bit on the side in this issue, but definitely there is definitely a marketing issue, and like it is again like wine and marketing, and especially when we talk about like quote unquote the old world and like French, Italian, Spanish, American, and German wine, like it is so hard. There is so much culture and so much kind of like tradition going into the label, into all those kind of things, that like really approaching it with a pure marketing standpoint, it is challenging.
Well, and I think the other thing that we maybe sometimes forget when we're talking about the actual grape growing and production side of things is all of this is controlled by the government. This is subsidized, controlled by the government, regulated by the government. This is not something we experience here in the United States in our wine growing regions. And so while there are a lot of pros to that in Europe, there's also a lot of cons like this, where you can't just let your vines go by the wayside. You can't just like go to Greece for the summer and just let them hang out, right? So I think when we're talking about regulatory conditions for some of these markets, that is something to consider. Vanessa, you brought up something when you're talking about the actual production of these wines, right? Because even if you harvest the grape, you have to turn them into wine. And that is another issue. Not that this is all negative, Nancy, because I do want to mention that like Bordeaux's delicious and we should be drinking more of it. But but Wired recently reported that wine is getting pricier thanks to a logistical nightmare. And I'm sure both of you have experienced this with trying to get allocations on time. And living in Napa, we certainly hear about it from our friends who are actually producing wine. But like so many other industries, we are experiencing supply chain issues. And we're experiencing a lot of logistical issues related to not only the raw materials like grapes, but also, as you mentioned, Vanessa, corks, glass, labels, and all of the complications around that. Something like glass, John Rule, the CEO for Trefethen Family Vineyards in Oak Knoll, not too far from us in Napa, glass used to be 6 to 8 months, is now like 12 to 18 months. Now, why is that an issue? Well, one, obviously they want to move these wines as quickly as possible for cash flow, but also for a lot of wineries, and I'm not sure what the case is for Trefethen, a lot of wineries don't have their own bottling facilities. So when you have delays on glass and like cork and your capsule enclosures, by the way, you're going to see a lot more bottles without the actual capsule enclosures coming up because a lot of people haven't been able to get them. But when it takes that much time and when they don't arrive on time, you can't just reschedule your mobile bottler. You've got to book those things way in advance. And so if you miss that appointment, it's not like, hey, can you come back tomorrow? As they mentioned in the article, it's like, well, I don't have this. So like, let's reschedule for 6 months out because that's how far out these guys are booked. And so it's presenting a lot of complications. I'm curious, how you guys have seen that manifest in your respective positions?
Just logistical delays, but shipping charges going up for everybody. Cost, as you said, of goods. But and I'll say, we experience, we make a wine called Maayan and I make a wine called Pas de Cheval, and we had to order glass like over a year in advance for the reason that you said, because it's just too risky. They're like, well, we have it now, but we might not have it 6 months from now, so it's just like, well, what do you do? So again, going back to like all these things that cost money, and then you have to, so we had to do it. It's too risky not to have your packaging. And the other thing to consider too is you made a great point, Amanda, about like mobile bottling lines for a lot of these small wineries, or even if they have their own bottling line, it impacts the quality and the style of the wine, how long you leave it in tank or barrel.
Totally.
So people might actually be forced to have a different style of wine that they're bottling if it's pushed off for, weeks to months to God knows how long. And there's just one other definite example, someone who I won't name, but you definitely both know, told me recently over some cocktails about a surcharge that he got for his glass order, where normally there would be maybe like a $3,000 surcharge every year. He got a $35,000 unexpected surcharge bill. And then there's just like,
oh my gosh,
they're like, well, that's just what it is, And so again, you're like, well, do I take the glass? Do I not take the glass? And of course you take it, but it's no joke. It is really no joke what this article is talking about. Wow. I definitely see it. Yeah.
I definitely see more like the later stage of the issue, because again, it is a very big issue. I'm obviously less involved with like all the packaging and like all the conditionments of the wine at the winery, but like just seeing like the shipping delay and like all the issue that obviously the past couple of years has brought up. Obviously, I'm gonna talk mostly with the market that I've been experiencing the most in the past 10 years, which is Europe. And based in London, you had Brexit that happened, then you had the pandemic, and like you had a shortage of drivers. All that creating such a craziness in the wine world, and some pallets of wine that was sitting in Burgundy that was supposed to be picked up one day. Well, some transporters never heard of those pallets of wine until like 2 months after, when the winemaker would reach out back. It's like, hey, by the way, your pallet is still here. And it's when you ship wine, obviously from Europe to America or to America to Europe, etc., etc. It's like, the minus delay that you have on the glass, on the label, on the person that's coming to bottle your wine at the winery, to the transporter, to the custom, obviously, because there's been a huge delay at the customs. All that's add up. And it adds up financially and obviously in time also.
And Vanessa, you brought up such a great point. I never considered the fact that these your fresh Sauvignon Blanc that maybe you're gonna enjoy in 2021 vintage maybe now has a little bit more texture because it's been sitting just a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's a good point. It's a really good point, right? I guess in some cases it's like, well, if the oak has to age a little longer, but then like, what if you needed those barrels? What if you needed those used barrels for future? So like, it really does sort of like. It's
like a domino effect.
Thank you. A domino effect. Mm-hmm. God, sometimes on these podcasts, I'm just at a loss for words. Sometimes I'm good. Sometimes I'm not. Well, I guess this is a great time for us to hope that you think that we're great, because I'm going to ask you all to like, subscribe, and review this podcast. Mm-hmm. As we always do, it's really, really helpful if you're enjoying the show, enjoying Vanessa and I ramble with a couple other people on the show about domino effect. If you enjoy that, please go ahead and leave us a review and like this podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. And if you do leave us a review on the podcast, we might read it out loud like I'm about to do right now. And this one is from Kuma2476, who said, "Great podcast. This podcast is great, and I couldn't stop listening to the episode with Bert Kreischer. It's a good one.
That's a good one.
It's a really good one. I must have listened to it 2 to 3 times. The other interviews are fantastic overall. Great conversations. Thank you so much to Kuma. Thank you for those super kind words. I couldn't agree with you more. I loved that episode. In fact, I think I was sitting in this exact same spot where I am today, recording the episode, thinking, wow, like how lucky are we both to be able to get to do this. As always, if you are loving this podcast and you're not drinking with us, there's something wrong. It's time to join the Podcast Wine Club. It's the Wine Access Unfiltered Wine Club. We're going to ask you to open your bottle that's in your shipment. It's a good one. Not that they're all not great, but you guys are probably familiar by this point with our friend Dan Petrosky. This episode, we're going to be focusing on his wine, the Massican Anya, from the 2021 vintage. Listen, we don't often get really cool allocations like this. We get really cool allocations, but this one was really special thanks to Gabrielle, who called up Dan. Both of us live near Dan and know him really well, and yet and Gabrielle gets the pool around here. So like, I don't know, we got to buy him like better gin for his cocktails or something. But anyway, the way this all worked out was we asked Gabrielle what he'd like, and he's like, I really like Massican. And we're like, yeah, so do we, but like, I don't know if we can get it for the podcast. And then Dan was like, sure, we'll make it happen.
He was like, oh, Gabrielle wants it.
Oh, it's for Gabrielle?
Okay, sure.
I thought we had
He's
full.
awesome.
I'm teasing, obviously. But yeah, so that's what we're going to be drinking. So if you are drinking with us, go ahead and grab that wine. We'll be back in just a second to dive into Veganuary. All right, well, cheers, everyone. This wine is delicious. Cheers. And as I sit here and I sip this, Gabrielle, I've got to ask you. So for those of you who aren't unfamiliar with Love Medicine Park, we have talked about this before. This is an amazing restaurant, 3 Michelin-starred restaurant in New York City, one of the best in the world. It's gotten every accolade that a restaurant could possibly get, and Gabrielle is the wine director. But a couple years ago, actually not too long ago, the restaurant went from your traditional French-American inspired cuisine and it went fully plant-based. It made the headlines. Everybody was talking about it. There were a lot of opinions on the topic. But I have to ask, Gabrielle, how did you find out about the transition from what Love Medicine Park was to becoming an all-vegan restaurant?
I found out in February 2020, and 11 Medicine Park reopened with the current menu, or with the current format, I should say, in June 2020. At the time I was in London, I was working for Chef Daniel Humm already. I was the wine director for a restaurant called Davis and Brook. And I found out, like the same with the other manager back in London, when we had a little bit of a meeting with the people at the HQ in London, and with Chef, who explained us basically his vision for the future. And I think at first we were definitely a little bit shocked in the way that there is some chef that had such an impact with some really iconic dishes. And when it comes to Chef Humm, like at the time, he was definitely celery root cook in a pig bladder. It was the duck, dry-aged duck with honey glaze, lavender, beautiful piece of meat. Foie gras was obviously a big part of the menu. So like shifting from almost an extreme to another was definitely a big shock. But like speaking with Chef, it all made sense. And I think Chef and 11 Medicine Park had always been rushing and running after reinventing itself. And the pandemic really gave kind of like this opportunity for first kind of obviously and unfortunately for the world to stop, but for chef's creative mind to stop also and like reflect on like the past years and like what the future will be, and like could 11 Mason Park, after those 2 terrible years for the industry, for the public health, like just reopen as it was, like if nothing happened? No, that wasn't the right call, and I think something had to change. And using the platform that 11 Mason Park has was definitely an amazing opportunity for us. Like, it would have been a smaller restaurant. Will have the impact be the same? Probably not. Will the resources to make that happen be the same? Absolutely not either. So it's really like a conjunction of so many factors that make this change really, really unbelievable.
Were there any hints leading up to it? Like, were there rumors? Had you seen anything?
The only hint we should have all picked up on is that vegetable has always been present and also always been like some sort of a highlight in 11 Mason Park history. Remember years ago, one of the most successful dish that has been on the menu was a carrot tartare. Yes, there were some egg yolk. Yes, there were like some animal protein in it, but like showcasing tableside and making a tartare out of carrots, that's something.
Well, I have a question. Were there any? Your list is amazing, by the way. It really is it's a book. There are so many amazing producers, regions, styles, varieties. But were there any wines that you either then added to the list or took off your list when the menu changed to plant-based?
So first, I'm going to bounce back on something. Like, the list is really, really amazing. And that's a testament for the past 25 years of my predecessors, both wine directors and all the wine team. I always look at myself as just being the guardian of this list for the time of my tenure, and like hopefully set up the next generation for success the same way like the previous generation has done for the team right now and myself. And I'm very, very grateful for that. When it comes to the reopening and like approaching the wine list, we did not necessarily like look at like removing any producer. Like, I truly believe that a wine list, and especially when we talk about a wine list such as 11 Mason Park wine list, like, which is like without any pretension, like a world-class wine list, like where we really want these lists to be looked in by many people across the world, like just out of curiosity and like just for some ideas. It didn't feel good to like just scrap producer that we might have worked with for the past 25 years and that supported us and we supported, and we share common belief and common direction in where we want to go. Didn't feel right to like scrap them. And also like chef would say, like, we're not the vegan police. If someone wants to come at the restaurant, have our menu with like a 2019 Napa Cab made with a lot of new French oak, that might not be the best pairing, but if that pleases you and that's the moment you want to have in the restaurant, we have the responsibility to make that happen, and we need to make sure that those wines are present on the list. What it definitely gave us the opportunity to is like to open the list slowly, and also the pairing slowly, to a different approach. I mean, the pairings has always been extremely creative here at 11 Mason Park, but definitely now we have less boundary in what a pairing should be, in a way, if that makes sense.
It's such a good point. And I worked at a Napa Valley steakhouse with an all Napa Valley wine list, right? So a lot of cab. And we had seafood towers, right? And so people would come in and they'd get their 2018 Scarecrow and they'd have it with their seafood tower, raw fish, lobster, oysters, whatever. And it was great. It was kind of like, well, if that's what makes you happy, that's great. Like, I think one of the things that we all have to remember as wine professionals is that it doesn't have to be the perfect pairing all the time. It has to be the right wine and the right dish for you. And if you love both, you can love them together, even if it may not be the most formulaic approach, right? I am curious, though, as a wine professional, was there research that you had to do to further understand how wine can work with plant-based pairings? Because we're not just talking about like chef putting a couple of diced beets on a plate, right? These are very, very beautiful, very elaborate. Like, if anything, there's probably more time that goes into the platings of these dishes. I have to imagine that it requires a lot of work to understand some of the other things that are going onto the plate. And so there are some amazing plant-based restaurants around the country. You know, you have Dirt Candy in New York, you've got Veg here in Philly, which is where I am now, Gracias Madre and Los Angeles. Did you look to any other plant-based restaurants around the country or even in the world to further understand what you could maybe do on a different level with the wine list?
Yes and no. I mean, we always look for inspiration from all over the place. But when I took on the job and started to work on my first pairings, because obviously, like, it is a part of like the wine program when we work with the plant-based menu, the wine pairing has to be on point. And it was a lot of just trying the food and trying a few ideas. And really, like, I try to detach myself, and I try to force the team to do so as well, to detach myself to what has been done, what was the rules, and what other people might be doing, even though it might be an amazing influence and an amazing ideas, but just to kind of approach it with like a blank page. It's again like an amazing opportunity for us because we approach a menu and we approach wine pairing with like no boundaries. And I think that's definitely something that in the kitchen, like, you can feel like there is no more boundaries of like, we have to have a foie gras, we have to have a butterscotch cluster, we have to have the duck, and like every season, like the set of those dishes will change. And obviously that will have dictated the pairing at the time. Like, you have to have, I don't know, a sweet one with the foie gras to be super French and traditional, like my son sometime. You might have to have like a white burgundy with the lobster and a northern rhone with the duck. So all that is kind of scrapped and no, from one menu to another menu is a blank page completely. And that really is the focus that I try to have with the team, to try to keep ourselves into our group and use the entire team as a resource, to really have everyone to bring ideas, everyone to say, oh, I tasted that like 2 months ago and that could be a good idea. Like, okay, let's try it out. You know, it's a lot of trial and a lot of fail. I have to be completely honest with you. Sure. Like, there has been something that we tried and like didn't work out, and like we review our page and we move forward. So we've been very, I want to say, very much in autarcy in that sense.
What are some examples of things that didn't work?
Well, we used to put Chocolina from Amestoy last summer menu with a beautiful dish. It was a radish tostada with tomburi, which is a small bean that's coming from the summer cypress tree in Japan. And when we talk about it, like you were mentioning, like, it's not just a couple of cubes of bits in a dish. Like, the seeds are like unharvested, they are dried, seasoned, etc. It's like, it's the labor and like the time that goes into the menu is almost more important now than it used to be. And so we used to pair that with a Chacolina, which at first we thought was a really cool pairing. But turned out that, you know, at the end of the day, the guest is right. And like, if the guest perception is not right, like, it did not work out because that wasn't the right setting for it. Was the pairing not right? No, it did work. But we need also to take in consideration the fact that we are in the middle of Manhattan at 11 Madison Park, which is 3 Michelin-star restaurant. And like, all those factors are really, really important also to take in consideration. So that's one example of things that unfortunately didn't work out.
Was it a function of like, did people, I mean, Chocolina tends to be a less expensive wine. Was it just people didn't think that it was fancy enough, or?
Pretty much, yeah. Like, the main negative feedback we had was like, yeah, they had this sensation that it didn't work out. Like, they didn't have for their money in a way.
Didn't have
and
like
as
soon
factor. Yeah, exactly. And as soon as we thought that, like, we scrap it and like we move on to onto something else, and that was it.
I will say though, Amestoy, I love that wine. So I have a question. Is there one vegetable that if you see it, you know, chefs working on a new menu, you see it, you're like, oh no, like, that is so hard to pair?
Asparagus, definitely. Which the season is coming very, very, very quickly upon us, but it's definitely a product that, and a vegetable that, I mean, you ask the same question, I guess, to any sommelier, any wine professional across the world. Like, artichoke and asparagus are definitely two very difficult pairing, and I think it's when we need as sommelier to take a step back and let the dish shine on its own, almost like. And the way I like to look at pairing is there's two different pairing. Either do we want the food to shine or do we want the wine to shine? And finding this balance between and throughout the entire menu of like, all right, this is like definitely a vegetable that's gonna clash with many wine. Like, all right, let's find a wine that's gonna settle like right underneath and be such a beautiful cushion for it to really shine through and like express itself.
I want to talk a little bit about the more technical aspects of food and wine pairing when it comes to plant-based. Obviously, we're not dealing with any sort of animal fats or animal protein, two things that typically lend themselves to making a wine and pairing experience really fun. Dishes also tend to be a little less salty. You tend to have a lot fewer things, although of course I think when we're talking about Chef Hume's dishes, like they probably have all those things in spades, right? But when you're talking about like food and wine pairing 101, right? You've got salt, fat, acid, heat, and you've got all the pairable components of that. What are some of the rules, if any? I mean, outside of the fact that like you can pair anything with anything, right? As long as you like it. Are there like technical rules when it comes to plant-based pairings?
No, I think there is element in the dish that we definitely pay a little bit more attention to. Like bitterness is definitely one of them. Acidity also. Chef Hume has always had like a culinary signature in a way of like having dishes which are really fresh with a lot of acidic component into it, which weren't so much of an issue in the past because that was part of the garnish or part of the sauce, and like that would be just an element. When no, like you have those dishes which are really flavorful, really intense, and where all those texture elements and like again the bitterness and the acidity are definitely two elements that we really look after very carefully. Yes, we don't have like fat out of animal protein, but we have very other different way to like mimic that in a way, and that can be with I don't know some seitan, that can be from the way we're gonna glaze a special product, or the way we roast mushroom, like that gonna give you like this texture very almost oily on the palate, and like so. Definitely, the pairing and the way we approach pairing, technically speaking, is more of a, I want to say, of a textural approach, almost than an aromatical approach to it.
I want to go back to bitterness for a second. So, how do you work with bitterness? What are there specific regions, specific grapes, specific producers? How do you combat bitterness? Because if we're talking about vegetables, a lot of vegetables have bitterness. You mentioned asparagus before, great example.
Yeah, I mean bitterness. Again, it obviously depend on like how intense the bitterness will be present on the dish, but like I will always try to go away from anything with higher alcohol volume. So like Northern Hemisphere would be definitely a more interesting area to explore, like wine with a little bit more acidity, lower sugar content, obviously, like some dry Riesling, some Grüner Veltliner who might bring a little bit of like this textural element that the Grüner tends to bring. Like, and after, if you go and dig a little deeper, like there is some producer, like we work a lot with Emmerich Knoll, who's gonna have like those style of Grüner Veltliner, who has a little bit more of like this generosity and texture and richness to it. We're gonna really like englobe and like capture the bitterness to balance it out a little bit. So that will be definitely some areas. And when we're looking at like asparagus, for instance, like, yeah, Grüner Riesling will be definitely some areas that we were going to play with. And also sometimes, like if you look after asparagus, you get this greenness, this leafiness coming through it. Sometimes it's actually fun to actually play on that and bring something that's a little, have this feeling of little underripe greenness coming to it. And you kind of match them up together, and with the right match, it works really, really well, and it's actually really, really fun.
That's interesting you said about sweetness. So when you're talking about bitterness, sweetness does not combat bitterness. You tend to go more dry to work with bitterness.
Yeah, you work with something a little drier, but you need a little bit of texture.
But texture is what you're after.
But texture is definitely what we're after. Yeah. I mean, the sweetness, because the thing also is like, I want to say the bitter the dish, usually they will come sooner in the menu. So we also don't necessarily want to start with something that's overly intense, overly powerful, overly sweet, or like will be really so much out there that like in the progression of the pairing will not necessarily make sense and be maybe a little too soon for that. So obviously, like any wine pairing, we have to think about the progression of the menu, the progression of the courses, what's coming before, what's coming after. And so that's why usually when we come across again asparagus or artichoke for that matter, or those kind of products, they might tend to come in the first like 2-3 courses of the menu. And so we can play with something a little drier, a little more underneath, but still again, like thinking about texture, thinking about like this richness, this roundness you can have on the palate without looking for sugar.
That kind of describes the wine that we have in our glass right now.
100%.
Right?
100%.
So very aromatic. So we've got the Mexican Anya, and for those who are not familiar, this is a California white wine that Dan Berchowski makes. This is 51% Tokai Friulano, 33% Ribolla Gialla, and 16% Chardonnay. And so I think this is a really good example of a wine that has a lot of texture, still has great acidity, is really aromatic, but is bone dry, right? There's no residual sugar on this wine. Is bitterness something that you would pair with this wine, or would you go in a different direction?
I think Dan, on top of being an absolute amazing human being, makes absolutely stunning wines. And Anya especially is almost one of the perfect white wine to pair with plant-based, in the way that you have this versatility into it. Like you can play with temperature and make it a little bit sharper, a little bit drier, even leaner by serving it a little colder. If you serve it a little warmer, you get a little bit more texture. The Chardonnay can start to come through and a little bit more oiliness. And you have again like this versatility of like, yeah, with bitterness and like with something a little bit more, I would say fresher on the dish. That works so well. But also because it takes a lot of influence from like white Italian grape varieties and like this kind of like direction. And like, if you think about, like the Friuli, Trentino, like the northeastern part of Italy, you have so many of those grape variety and those style of wine that works really well with vegetable. I mean, Italy at large is a country where quote unquote plant-based, like cooking just with olive oil and local vegetable, like it's in the culture for centuries. And looking into those region for I don't know, Verdicchio and those style of grape variety also is definitely super interesting and works amazingly well.
Was there a fear or an uncertainty that going plant-based would affect your 3-star Michelin status?
I've worked in other 3 Michelin star, 2 Michelin star, etc. In some institutions where, like, when you get the Michelin star for the first time, it's always like it is the goal. Like you want 1 when you have 1, you want 2 when you have 2, you want 3, and when you have 3, every year is a roller coaster in a way. And every year, like when the Michelin comes around, like everyone is a little stressed. And I want to say that especially in the past October, when the Michelin was released in New York City, yes, we had fear. Like, and the same fear that we had when we reopened the restaurant and when the first review came in, and like we reworked some few things, and like it is for us so important and such a statement in a way to have people like the Michelin Guide to recognize what we do, and that recognize that it is the direction in which the industry is going. And when I say that, I'm not saying that every single restaurant in the world has to be plant-based. That's absolutely not the point here. The point is just to show that you can do a luxury, quote unquote, luxury experience without any animal protein. And that's kind of almost like an art performance on its own. And when Michelin came around and like awarded us 3 Michelin star, that was like, we actually threw quite a big party in the
As
dining
you should.
room.
As well, you should.
It was wild. It was wild, but
was it plant-based?
it was 100% plant-based. Yeah, definitely. With a lot of wine at the end of the night, but no, it was amazing, and it was also amazing that it happened actually during service. So obviously, all the cook, we had a private event upstairs. So in the private event kitchen, we were looking on our phone, like. In Major office, we had some computers on with the live stream, and like as soon as the result came in, like everyone rushed into the dining room, everyone rushed into the kitchen to celebrate together. guests were celebrating with us, and you have this kind of both type of guests. Some of them were like, yeah, I mean, yeah, you're 3 Michelin star. Like there were no question asked. And like there were the other guests who were like, this is amazing. And like was also like us, like really impatient to know the result of that, and very, very excited when it happened.
How many of the guests knew that it was release night? Like, did they know that they were at the Oscars?
No, not that many. Not that many. There is also the fact that like releasing our booking a month in advance. Like some people will plan sometime whenever it's available, and around some other parameter. But as soon as they knew, like they party with us. Like we had a table who stayed with us, like I don't know, until like 2 or 3 in the morning. At some point, I mean, like when they were at the last table, we approached them. It's like, we're gonna have a party right now. You're more than welcome to stay. Just hug to you. So, and they stayed with us. Like they just enjoyed the moment with us. So it was such an amazing and such a beautiful moment.
If I can just give a compliment too, is I've been fortunate enough to have dined at EMP twice since the plant-based menu, once in the summer, and then most recently in December when Wine Access partnered with EMP. We had a private dinner upstairs and kind of showcased what Wine Access does, along with Gabrielle's pairings as well, and the menu. And there was the final savory dish. You have to help me if I'm getting this wrong, but it was maitake mushrooms with juniper and pine, and I think seitan.
Yeah.
And it was mind-blowingly good. And everyone around the room just kind of got really quiet and just like just needed a minute to kind of take it all in. And what I really want to compliment you on is that unanimously in that dining room, everyone was like, this is one of the best dishes that I've ever had. And it wasn't in context of plant-based menus. It was all menus that this was one of the most extraordinary dishes that anyone had had.
Yeah, I think it's like the team in the kitchen does such an incredible job. I mean, we also need to bear in mind the fact that when we like at the difference of like before the pandemic and before the restaurant closed, and like we would change like 3-4 courses on every single menu, and obviously the set that goes with the protein. When nowadays, like we are redoing an entire menu from scratch with no place where we can actually look for a recipe to base on. Like every recipe that we create them from scratch, and it's just a tremendous amount of work that also has to happen. Like when some vegetables are not even yet in season. So the culinary team and the R&D team has to kind of work their head around of like, how can we work this product given the fact that we don't have this product right now physically to cook. So it's definitely all the credit in the world to them. It is a unique menu. Like you have close to nothing similar anywhere in the world. And like it is a true experience in the fact that there is the experience that we provide in the dining room and like the hospitality that we provide in the dining room, the portung on table side, the Dreamweaver program and all those kind of things. But like in the plate, like there is nowhere else in the world where you're going to get that. And that's definitely something that's really mind blowing to me, is like having the chance and to work with dishes that did not exist 6 months ago.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought that you just brought up that I hadn't considered before, which is, when you're a chef and even when you're a somm, right, you are often working with animal protein, which is fairly consistent day after day, month after month, year after year, right? Like beef, cattle will change a little bit in the marbleization. You can change the cut. But for the most part, like you kind of know what you're expecting. When it comes to plant-based, you're dealing with a lot more variables, right? Not every asparagus is going to be the same level of bitterness. Not every season from year to year is going to be exactly the same. You're dealing with a lot of factors when it comes to raw materials that you have absolutely no control over because it is entirely Mother Nature. It's a lot like wine in those ways. What are some of the ways in which you deal with that as a sommelier? I mean, are you just kind of like playing roulette and hoping that like there is some consistency, or like
there is many things that come in play. First, we have, and we started a couple of years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, with a partner, and we started a farm upstate New York, Magic Farm. So most of our product will come from this farm. So that kind of allow us to have a farm only dedicated to 11 Mason Park, and that kind of allow us to forecast the crop. We're not farmer, and nobody within the company is a farmer. So it's also something that we have been trying to figure out for the past 2 years of like, all right, when do we need to plan that for it to be ready when we want to launch the menu, given that usually about 4 months in advance, we already know when the next menu dates, which dinner we are going to launch this new menu, meaning that we need this crop to be ready by that time. And like you say, like it's natural after all. Like it's like asking a winemaker to every single year, like harvest at this exact same day. Like every year will be different. So I think there is one strength that we have in this restaurant and in this company is that we love change. We expect change. Things are going to change. We're going to embrace the change. And we're just going to figure it out in a way. And like if something is not working the way we planned on, well, we're going to fall back on a plan B in a way. So we just try to get our ear in the kitchen as much as possible, have the conversation open with chefs across the board as much as possible, so we can also have a backup plan if something doesn't work.
I think, as we think about plant-based pairings, like how much has your opinion on plant-based changed? How much has it informed what you're doing at home? How much has it informed you as a sommelier?
A lot. Your listener will have figured out by now I have a very strong French accent. I come from the middle of France where animal protein is been part of my culture. My father is Sicilian. So again, like there is a lot of protein being mostly seafood product in the culture from there. So I grew up with animal protein, but I think I'm also part of a generation that at first we didn't necessarily realize that those resources are not unlimited. It's just realizing that chefs should by now be able to see that within their menu, they can integrate 1, 2, maybe 3 dishes, depending on the size of the menu, that are fully plant-based. And this small change has a tremendous effect. If you think and you look out and you zoom out and you look at a year consumption, that's why we started to can talk about when we launched 11 Mason Farm a few months back to try to encourage people to have 1 day in the week or 1 day every 2 weeks or 1 day in the month, like just plant-based food, 1 day. And again, if you had that, exactly, meatless Monday. But it definitely pushed me to question more and more, like what restaurant and what menus are and how we can push that further. And again, especially in a Michelin star setting where there is still this fear of like, yeah, if you go in a Michelin star setting, and I want a vegan menu, it's going to be like only 2 salad, 2 beet, and maybe a peach at the end to finish, when there's so much more to do, so much more. Like it's it is a limitless world when we talk about plant-based in a way.
Yeah. Where does red wine fit into the equation? Like, I think when people think about plant-based, or at least my mind immediately goes to white wine, right? Like red, typically, it has tannin. It likes to bind with animal protein. Typically doesn't work in a more traditional aspect of food and wine pairings. And I know that your wine list is deep in Burgundy and Bordeaux. And as you mentioned, 2019, Napa Cab, like they want to have red wine. So where does that fit into the equation? How do you manage that? Do you just let them do what they want, or are there actually dishes that work with it?
There is a lot of dishes that works with it. And especially like right now, we are at the end of the fall menu and about to launch our winter menu. Like we had the mushroom season that's are just perfect for red wine, and like being like going into a lighter style of red wine, depending the dish and like the component of the dish and the intensity of the dish, to a more structured red wine. But instead of going for a younger vintage of those structured red wine, we're gonna force ourselves to source like older vintages or to pick into our cellar older vintages. That's again like the luxury that we have here to have more than 20 years of buying and of a cellar being built. We have a deepness in the list and in the vintages, which is a huge luxury. And when we talk again about mushroom, like you go in Piedmont, you go in the Napa in, I don't know, the mid-90s are absolutely stunning Cabernets to pair with those kind of dishes.
beyond mushrooms, what else? What else goes with red wine that's plant based?
You get seitan, and again, like it is important to like think about plant-based, and especially at the level that we're trying to execute it, as not only one ingredient in the dish, which is often what we picture. And myself also, like a couple of years back, you would have asked me this question. I would say like, yeah, well, a cabbage, like what am I going to pair with a cabbage? Well, it's not only a cabbage. It's like a cabbage that might be marinated in a little bit of soy. It might be roasted. It might be pickled. It might be, so it's really like a dish to dish kind of thing. Like there is so little generality of like this red wine will go with every single vegetable there is, or like, but if you look at beet, for instance, to go back on the beet thing, beet is an amazing product to pair with red wine. Like you have this natural earthiness coming from it. You have like this sucrosity coming from it, this sweetness coming from it. That if you look at like a bottle of Pinot, or a Grenache maybe, like those kind of variety and those kind of wine match superbly well with the beet. But again, it all depends on like how you are going to prepare it, and which sauce gonna go with it, and all those kind of factors.
And I will say, Amanda, because I think that's a really good question. I know some people also are like, well, I only drink red wine, so is this gonna work, at EMP? But I do remember when I was there in December, we had only one white pairing. I think we started with the Trimbach, the Riesling from Alsace, and then we had Chinon, we had, I think, a Northern Rhone, we had a Rioja, we had a Chianti, and we had Bordeaux. It all worked.
It's interesting because I had this conversation a couple of months ago. I was at an event in Sonoma, and we were working with we were having an Indian dinner. I was an Indian chef, and we were doing it with lots of different sparkling and lots of like traditional California wines, sparkling wines, Pinot, Chardonnay. And it's interesting because I think I at least in my cohort, it's always been Indian food works really well with natural wines, which they do. But I think like when we started pairing them with other types of wines, we were like, oh, this can actually be really amazing. And so I think pigeonholing ourselves as wine professionals into these more traditional wine pairings can, I think it's important to know what the fundamentals are. I think it's important to know what the rules are, but it's also important to know that it's okay for the rules to be broken sometimes. And it's okay to just drink what you like. And it's okay to try some things. And to your point, like, all right, so you're going to have a little asparagus, you're going to have some cabbage, you're going to have some other great vegetables, like open the red wine. What's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to have a great glass of wine and some cabbage. Like, okay, what's the big deal? It's okay. Try it out.
And use also the technique in the kitchen. Like if you have the chance to have a grill at home, well, grill them, and you will see that like just those like smoky and like this those burnt flavor almost, like they work so well with red wine, and they help to actually kind of like elevate those vegetables in a way to really make sense with a bottle of red wine.
It's 2023, y'all. Break some rules. Chef Hoon broke all the rules, and he did okay. Gabrielle's breaking some rules as well. Vanessa, you breaking any rules in 2023?
Oh, probably a lot, but I'm not going to tell you what they are yet.
Smart girl. Yeah, don't break the rules and tell anybody. Just break the rules, and then just have a sly smile on a podcast. We've got a few questions from the audience that I want to ask before we wrap. What is the best plant-based cheese to pair with Sauvignon Blanc? Do you have any plant-based dairy that you really?
No.
I know Miyoko's is a favorite. There's some really great ones anymore. Plant-based dairy or dairy alternatives have become really great. I mean, you guys are making your own, so you probably don't use anything like that.
And we actually don't have a cheese course right now. It's not necessarily the direction that we take the menu at the moment, but we do receive like very often some sample of like some company who will make like especially with cashew and like a lot of nuts like this. And it's getting better and better. And again, I am French. I have a big history of eating cheese of very different variety. And it's very often that I'm like sitting down and, oh my God, this is really delicious and so convincing.
How do I pair my powerful tannic red wines with plant-based dishes? We kind of touched on this a little bit. It sounds like preparation is kind of key, right? Lean into the grilling, the roasting, charge.
Use a little bit of olive oil, try to bring a little bit of sucrosity and sweetness and richness into your dish, a little bit of texture, like this roundness, and like basically trying to find and trying to use element and component who's gonna cover a little bit your palate. which is ultimately what a steak will do with the natural fat present in the steak, and obviously the tannin will play with the blood and all those things. But it's really using texture is really something that all as human being and as diner, and like we all have in common at different level again. But it's so important. It's so crucial.
And the last one, I don't know, maybe Vanessa's already answered this with her final EMP dish, but what is the most unique pairing EMP has done since going plant-based?
Probably this one. Actually, we're thinking of doing one with beer on the next menu, but that's not finalized yet, so I don't necessarily want to talk about in case things change. Like I told you, we love to change. We love to change things. I will use probably the tofu collard greens with the cumin jus and the chinon from Olga Raffo that we've done. It was such a great pairing. It worked so well together. And even myself didn't necessarily believe on it at first, on the paper, I want to say. And then as soon as I started to test it, it's like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense.
You've mentioned Chinon a few times now. I think we didn't have a second wine on this episode, but I think if we had it, probably should and could have been Chinon. And there's so many great ones that Wine Access has. Right now, I think I've got like probably 6 in my cellar for because I think Chinon is one of the great food friendly wines on the planet. It's it's light, but it's textured, it's green, but it's got really great fruit. Like it's got all the things that you want, especially for plant-based, but also for non-plant-based as well. So I'll be sure if you're not following us on Instagram, I'll be sure to throw up some of our favorite Chinons that Wine Access has right now. It's basically all of them right now. If you just go on the site, it's all of them. I've sent many a Chinon to a friend over the holidays. You guys, that is our show for this week. We are so grateful to all of you who are in the Wine Club that drank with us for this episode. Again, this is the 2021 Massican Anya. I'm so obsessed with this shipment this time. I feel like we just had so much fun with it. So if you're loving this wine, please go ahead, snap it, Instagram it, tag us so that we can share that as well. And once again, if you are loving the show, we'd really appreciate you taking the time to leave us a review, subscribe to the show, and like this podcast if you are listening to it on other platforms that allow you to do that. Gabrielle, it sounds like you're in service, and if you're listening to the show and you're like, I hear some like mufflings in the background. He's at work, you guys. He is at a 3 Michelin starred restaurant that is open 7 days a week, trying to do their thing. So, thank you so much for not only taking the time, but also taking up space in a very busy restaurant. We had so much fun.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And hopefully Vanessa and I can make it up. Vanessa can go for her 3rd time. I will try to make it for my first visit. I've tried before. It's
yeah. Let me know when. I'm so there. Yeah.
Well, I sure will. I'm in Philly right now. I can be there tonight.
Don't wait too much anymore.
Well, good. I hope everyone's enjoying their January. Please consider going plant-based for, maybe a day, a couple days, a week, however is comfortable. And don't forget that you can still drink whatever wine you want with it. This has been the Wine Access Unfiltered show, hosted by myself, Amanda McCrossin, and Vanessa Conlon. We will see you all next time. Cheers.